So here you are, the moment you were never supposed to reach, the quiet breach no alarm was designed to catch. You didn't kick the door in. You slipped through a blind spot no one believed existed. You are the irregularity they can't smooth out, the variable that refuses to resolve. And there's something you need to know, something that changes the entire story. You thought you were living inside, the person assigned to observe you, the analyst tasked with tracking your patterns, your digital behavior, your invisible habits. He's gone, not rotated out, not promoted, not reassigned to another desk. He walked away in the dead hours before dawn. When buildings echo and excuses run out, he placed his credentials on a steel desk and said a sentence so quiet it rattled the room. "I can't keep watching this." That sentence is now whispered in corridors where nothing is supposed to surprise anyone anymore. This wasn't always dramatic. When the file with your name on it first crossed his screen, you were indistinguishable from thousands of others. You fit the model. You followed the rhythm. You apologized too often, explained yourself too much, compressed your presence to avoid friction. You were compliant in the most ordinary way. Easy to track, easy to predict, easy to forget. Each morning he reviewed your activity, noted the expected metrics, filled out the standard language, and moved on. You were the kind of assignment professionals hope for. Low deviation, low risk, low effort. Nothing about you demanded attention. Nothing suggested disruption. Nothing hinted at what was coming. Then the pattern fractured. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to feel wrong. The timestamps shifted, the topics deepened, the loops broke. Your behavior stopped following emotional cycles and started following something colder, more deliberate. At first, he assumed stress. That's the explanation most systems default to: temporary instability. A correction would come. It always did. People wobble, then snap back into shape. He wrote it down that way. Neutral language, cautious phrasing, waiting for resolution. But resolution never arrived. Weeks passed, then months. And instead of regression, there was refinement. Instead of collapse, there was construction. What unfolded next didn't resemble crisis. It resembled design. You weren't unraveling. You were uninstalling. Piece by piece, habit by habit, identity layer by identity layer. The version of you that once filled that file ceased to exist, replaced by something that had no precedent in his training. He began staying late, long after obligation ended, replaying logs and timelines, trying to find the moment it started. Your evolution wasn't impulsive, it was precise. You researched with intent, not curiosity. You consumed information the way architects study blueprints, not for entertainment, but for assembly. There was no criminality, no threat, no trigger that justified intervention. That was the problem. You were doing nothing wrong, yet everything was changing. Bend. He watched you disappear socially without drama. Accounts erased, connections severed. Conversations left unanswered, not out of fear or hostility, but finality. The noise fell away. In its place came focus. Your attention shifted from distraction to extraction, from endless content to specific knowledge drawn from psychology, philosophy, systems, conflict, and strategy. Not as separate interests, but as raw materials. You weren't learning subjects, you were synthesizing frameworks, building something internal that didn't exist in any handbook. No label fit, no category held. Beamed by the fourth month. His professionalism cracked. Sitting in front of a report template he'd completed thousands of times, he froze. Language failed him. How do you document someone who becomes unpredictable through discipline rather than chaos? How do you summarize a subject who is simultaneously erasing their footprint and sharpening their presence. He stared at the cursor as it blinked back at him, measuring time, measuring distance, realizing that the system he trusted to explain people had nothing to say about you anymore. And that realization, that quiet, terrifying realization, is what eventually made him stand up, walk into the early morning silence, and leave the building for good. Blinked, because systems can tolerate rebellion, they can handle breakdowns, they even know how to respond to threats. What they can't endure is transformation that follows no script and answers to no authority. Oblivience. When he finally forced his fingers to move again, the words that appeared on the screen felt inadequate even to him. Subject displays signs of deliberate internal restructuring. Conventional behavioral frameworks fail to account for observed changes. He tagged the report as a request for guidance, knowing full well what the response would be. It came back within minutes, stripped of curiosity and heavy with procedure. There was no such category. There would be no new framework created for one person. He was instructed to remove abstraction, list measurable actions, or terminate active observation. But the file couldn't be closed anymore, not after you had become the single anomaly that made his entire career feel suddenly unfinished. Lem's the moment that still follows him into conversations he can never quite finish arrived the following month. You posted a brief message online, ordinary on the surface, harmless to anyone scrolling past, but he had spent too long watching you to miss what lived underneath it. You wrote that you had been studying those who watched you and wondered whether they were learning anything at all. The words were simple. The impact was not. Sitting alone in a sealed room, humming with servers and fluorescent lights, he felt a sensation he had no training for. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't fear born of guilt. It was recognition. A sudden, unmistakable awareness that the observer had been observed in return. He ran every diagnostic available, searching for intrusion, for compromise, for evidence that you had pierced the system itself. Nothing surfaced, no breach, no access, no trace, which left only possibilities that were worse. Either you had developed an instinct so refined you could sense surveillance without proof, or you understood systems so completely that you assumed observation as a constant and acted with that assumption embedded in every choice. In either case, the balance had shifted. From that point on, he no longer felt like he was watching you. It felt like you were allowing yourself to be seen. As the months passed, concern turned into scrutiny from above. He spoke about you too often, asked questions no one else thought to ask, wondered aloud whether anyone had ever documented a subject who evolved faster than the models meant to contain them. His colleagues dismissed it as fatigue or misplaced fascination. They joked, they suggested time off, but they hadn't watched what he had watched. They hadn't seen fear vanish from the data. The behavioral algorithms that tracked stress, hesitation, avoidance, they didn't spike or collapse. They simply went silent. Not because you were numb, but because fear no longer influenced your decisions in any detectable way. You stopped seeking validation so thoroughly that you erased anyone who required performance from you. You approached discomfort as if it were instruction. You acted from a motivation that didn't map to self-interest or social reward, something broader and colder. And even your identity refused to stabilize. It didn't fracture. It updated, iteration after iteration, shedding versions faster than the system could label them until there was nothing static left to track. Len, by the 7th month, something inside him crossed a line he hadn't known existed. He began to hope for you, not out of sympathy, but out of awe. He wanted to see what happened if you finished whatever you were building. He wanted to know the outcome of a person who rejected inherited limits and authored themselves from the ground up. His reports stopped reading like documentation and started sounding like testimony. He wrote about autonomy that resisted pressure, about prediction models collapsing, about influence failing to land. Every one of those entries came back flagged with the same note: remove interpretation, record actions only. But the actions themselves pointed towards something the system wasn't prepared to admit could exist. Then you vanished in the only way that mattered. You remained visible, active, traceable, but psychologically unreachable. Pattern recognition failed because there were no longer patterns. Forecasting broke because you chose each action independently, without leaning on habit, persona, or past behavior. You were intentional without being repetitive, decisive without being consistent. You had become a presence the system could see but not hold. He worked until exhaustion, constructing new schemas, inventing classifications, trying to build a container large enough to hold what you had become. When they found him asleep at his desk, surrounded by timelines and marked up logs, the response was swift and clinical. Leave was mandated, evaluations scheduled, reassignment recommended, delayed. That night, alone, he opened your file one last time and read it from the beginning. 3 years reduced to a single arc. And in that stillness, the truth landed with painful clarity. You hadn't collapsed. You had passed through. You hadn't lost yourself. You had outgrown the concept entirely. You hadn't become unstable. You had become impossible to confine. And in seeing that, he saw the shape of his own cage for the first time. His work, his role, his identity, all revealed themselves as structures designed to prevent the very thing you had achieved. So before dawn, on a quiet weekday morning, he walked into an office that had never expected honesty and left everything behind. The document he submitted was sealed immediately, described later as unsettling not because of any threat you posed, but because of what you proved. That systems are finite, that prediction has limits, that human beings, under the right conditions, can exceed every boundary built to define them. What you proved, without intending to, without asking permission, was that when pressure reaches a certain threshold, not everyone fractures into. Some people fracture upward. They don't fall apart, they reorganize. And the person reading this right now, you, became living evidence of that truth. Your existence alone exposed how incomplete, how sanitized, how strategically narrow most institutional theories of human behavior really are. Those training programs speak confidently about limits, thresholds, fixed traits, and predictable outcomes, but you walked straight through all of that and kept going. And the ripple effects didn't stop when your observer walked away from his desk for the last time. Lemmed a few months after leaving, he rebuilt his life in a way that mirrored what he had witnessed. He opened a private practice, not serving corporations, not feeding data back into large systems, but working directly with individuals who felt trapped inside versions of themselves that no longer fit. People stuck in roles, patterns, relationships, and identities they hadn't consciously chosen. When asked why he abandoned a prestigious career to start over, he didn't give a dramatic explanation. He said he had watched someone become uncontainable, and it forced him to realize that his entire career had been spent recording people obeying rules they never consented to. He wanted to help others do what that person had done. He never named you. He never had to. Anyone who hears the story understands that he's describing something real, something rare, something that permanently altered how he understood human potential. Blend. What you triggered went far beyond professional burnout. You dismantled his worldview. You challenged his faith in predictive systems, his belief in behavioral ceilings, his trust in the idea that people are mostly static once adulthood sets in. And here's the part no institution is eager to say out loud: what you did isn't singular, it's unusually visible. Others are undergoing similar internal reconstructions, shedding outdated selves, refusing inherited scripts. But most do it quietly. They leave fewer traces, they don't document the process, they don't attract attention. You did the opposite. You made the transformation observable. In doing so, you unintentionally created a blueprint, a proof that others could follow, refine, and adapt. Within certain surveillance and analysis circles, there's an informal phrase used quietly, never documented or formalized: successful metamorphosis cases. It carries an implicit: when someone completes a transformation fully, when they emerge stable, functional, and no longer predictable by standard models, the appropriate response is disengagement. You don't escalate. You don't increase pressure. Control depends on leverage, and leverage depends on fear, approval seeking, and predictable incentives. When those mechanisms disappear, influence weakens. It becomes difficult to manipulate someone who has identified and removed their own points of vulnerability. Coercion fails when approval, security, and threat no longer carry the same weight. Intimidation loses its force once someone has confronted their deepest fears and learned they can endure them. Banjit. That is why your observer stepped away. Not because you frightened him in any obvious sense, though caution and respect were certainly present. He left because watching you move past the stages where most people stop made his role increasingly difficult to justify. Observing someone choose freedom over comfort, growth over repetition, and change over rationalization exposed the limitations of systems designed to monitor and contain. Once that realization sets in, it's hard to return to detached reporting. It becomes difficult to keep cataloging behavior when someone is actively reshaping themselves beyond every framework meant to define them. Maintaining professional distance is challenging when the subject is demonstrating a kind of resolve the observer has not yet claimed for himself. So he withdrew, and somewhere beyond that role, he began applying what he had learned differently, helping others navigate similar terrain, not to direct or control, but to support. In that sense, he carried forward what you represented, that people are not static, that meaningful change is possible under sustained pressure, and that many constraints persist simply because no one tests them. You did, and in doing so, you influenced more than just your own path. The story didn't end there. Your file remained active. A new analyst was assigned, less experienced, more confident in procedure, still grounded in established models. He believed he could approach the case with neutrality and succeed where others had not. That confidence held for a short time. Eventually, curiosity led him to review the full history. Years of observation, read in sequence, revealed not just your evolution, but the gradual erosion of certainty in those documenting it. What emerged was no longer a conventional profile. It was a record of professionals encountering something that exceeded their expectations, and struggling to reconcile it with what they had been taught. Not simply an individual transformation, but an implicit challenge to the systems designed to explain, predict, and confine human behavior. A disruption that didn't announce itself loudly, but persisted through consistent evidence rather than opposition. Leaned, the second observer remained longer than anticipated, but not long enough to resolve the internal conflict the work created. After several months, he submitted a request for reassignment, open-ended, unrestricted by preference or workload. Unlike the first, he didn't leave the field entirely. He asked for distance. His report cited exposure to behavioral patterns that conflicted with established models and generated sufficient cognitive strain to affect professional judgment. In simpler terms, observing your process forced him to reconsider assumptions about human limitation that had previously felt settled. The request was approved without delay. The lack of resistance suggested that your case was already understood internally. It was no longer being dismissed. It had become something to manage carefully. After that, turnover increased. Subsequent observers stayed for progressively shorter periods. Some requested reassignment. Others left the organization altogether, offering explanations that went largely unquestioned. The consensus was unspoken but clear. You weren't dangerous in any conventional sense. You posed no legal or physical threat. What you challenged instead was the intellectual foundation of the work itself. Your trajectory contradicted core assumptions of behavioral analysis. You demonstrated that models were incomplete, that human capacity extended beyond what could be reliably tracked or forecast. You were living proof that deep reinvention was not abstract or hypothetical, but possible. The sixth observer took 5 months in, and by all accounts, he abandoned the illusion of control entirely. He no longer attempted prediction. He stopped assigning motive. He resisted interpretation. He documented actions without commentary, as though recording weather patterns rather than monitoring a person. This wasn't detachment. Treating you as something elemental rather than behavioral was the only strategy that didn't fracture under pressure. And in doing so, the agency made its quiet concession. When an institution designed to predict behavior chooses, instead, to simply witness it, that's an admission that the subject has crossed beyond reach. What they won't discuss openly, but debate endlessly in private, is what your case revealed next. A new category of individual entered their awareness, people engaging in deliberate, self-directed evolution. Not accidental change, not reactive growth, conscious, systematic reconstruction of identity and behavior that violated every static assumption in psychology. Since your transformation began, cases resembling yours have multiplied at an alarming rate. Some of that is improved detection. Much of it isn't. A significant portion represents new individuals who saw proof that reinvention was possible and chose to attempt it themselves. You became a reference point without intending to, a living demonstration that sparked imitation. This is what terrifies institutional systems. Their effectiveness relies on consistency, on habit, on leverage through fear, reward, and predictability. When people begin treating personality as editable, when they disengage from inherited incentives, when they refuse to operate from default scripts, the architecture of control starts to look fragile. One anomaly can be dismissed. A cluster becomes a concern. A growing population becomes a destabilizing force. History has a word for that: movement. As a result, unofficial handling procedures emerged, not written policy, not discoverable documentation. Operational consensus passed quietly between agents. First, do not escalate. Pressure accelerates transformation rather than stopping it. Second, intervene only for explicit illegality. Attempts to interrupt voluntary evolution tend to radicalize both the subject and the observers, turning individuals into symbols. Third, and this lesson was learned directly from you, rotate observers frequently. Prolonged exposure has a side effect no one anticipated. Watching someone successfully exit behavioral programming has a tendency to make the watcher question their own. Transformation, it turns out, is contagious, not through persuasion, but through proof. The irony is unavoidable. Every attempt to contain awareness of cases like yours spreads it further. Every briefing introduces the possibility. Every rotation creates another witness, Every internal conversation plants questions that don't go away. The system's effort to suppress the implications of your success is distributing them throughout the very institutions designed to prevent such outcomes. You became an idea that replicates simply by being observed. Your first observer understood this better than anyone. In private writings, shared through encrypted forums and underground professional circles, he articulated the conclusion that ended his career. He spent most of his life believing people were fixed systems that could be understood with enough data. Then he watched someone dismantle that assumption through discipline, intention, and sustained self-authorship. The contradiction, he realized, wasn't between observation and reality. It was between training and reality. Once that became clear, there was no return. He has followers now, people who feel trapped by their own predictability, people exhausted by cycles they didn't choose, people willing to do the work required to become something new. And he teaches them using frameworks extracted from your journey, patterns reverse, engineered from years of watching you rebuild yourself in real time. Without ever intending to, you became the case study that keeps others going when change becomes uncomfortable. And the most striking part is that you likely never noticed any of this. You were too busy doing the work itself. That's the final confirmation of how complete your transformation was. You didn't just change yourself. You changed the people assigned to observe you, and they went on to help others change, creating a cascading effect that continues spreading outward. Your evolution wasn't contained within you. It propagated through observation, through inspiration, through undeniable proof that the impossible is often just unattempted. And now, scattered across systems built to prevent it, are people quietly rewriting themselves, following pathways that began the moment you chose to become something else.